So hi everyone, my name is Allison. I'm the Education Coordinator with Forest Ontario, which means that I work on the Ontario Envirothon program. I'd like to welcome you all to the second webinar for the 2017-2018 Ontario Envirothon webinar season. Today we are lucky enough to be joined by Rod MacRae, a food policy analyst and associate professor at York University with the Faculty of Environmental Studies. Rod's work is focused on changing Canada's food system so it becomes more environmentally friendly, healthy promoting, and just. Today he's going to be discussing how our current food system is both a major contributor and a possible solution to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. So Rod, you can take control of the computer now and take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Allison, and thanks everybody for joining in. Oops. Share screen, there we go. I'll just call this up. Okay, so here we go. Food systems and climate change. And again, so glad you can join us today. Really what we want to talk about is how to understand the way in which food systems are a strategic opportunity to actually reduce climate change impacts. And when I say food systems, I'm talking about all the things that help food get to your mouths. Everything from the inputs, the fertilizers, the pesticides, the equipment that farmers use on the farm, to how it moves to a food processor, how it gets to retail, the retail shops, and then how you get it into your own house and your own refrigerator, and then of course what happens to the waste after you've eaten. These are all the dimensions of the food system, and we'll talk about some of those in a bit more detail later. The big thing I think we need to understand about the food system is it is actually the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. And this isn't really recognized, unfortunately, by decision makers. And a lot of that is because the emissions are not always occurring where analysts think they are. And also the way we add up the numbers doesn't really make it obvious that the food system is such a big contributor. So by some accounts, I've listed a couple of sources there, up to 30% of total emissions on the planet are a result of the food system. And Canada, then, because we don't do a very good job of tracking entire food system data, we tend to focus just on agriculture. And these are the standard kinds of reporting categories that governments use. They were really initiated through processes internationally, what's called the IPCC. And agriculture, as you can see from the pie chart, the sort of the greenish brownish color there, is responsible for about 8% on average of total emissions in Canada. But when you look at the other categories, you know, the energy categories, the waste, the industrial processes, transport, food is a big part of all those categories as well. And that's why when you add up all the food system functions, you end up with at 30% instead of the smaller 8%, which is just associated with agriculture. And unfortunately, since 1990, this covers 90 to 2014, since 1990, most of the categories, the emissions are going up, including agriculture. As you can see, there was a little bit of a dip there after 2008, which is widely thought to be associated with what was an economic depression at the time. But since then, the numbers are going back up again. So if you look at 1990 versus 2014, you can see that all these categories are going up. And so what that says, of course, broadly speaking, is that in Canada, we're not doing a very good job at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And when we look at it via this pie chart, here we're looking at the main greenhouse gases themselves and to what extent each one contributes to the total emissions in Canada. And you can see, of course, that CO2, carbon dioxide, is the main ones, and then the other ones are smaller. The other ones, of course, are more powerful greenhouse gases than carbon dioxide is, but in order to put them all on the same footing, they use this notion of carbon dioxide equivalence, or as you can see there on the chart, CO2 EQ. And so this is a way to try and have a more standard comparison across the different greenhouse gases. The ones that are most important for the food system are CO2, N2O or nitrous oxide, and CH4 methane. I'll talk about those a bit more later. So looking just at agriculture, how does agriculture contribute all these gases? And they come from all kinds of different processes, which again is part of the reason why we're not doing a very good job of accounting for everything. And it also makes it, of course, more difficult to figure out what to do about the emissions. If everything was coming out of, a tailpipe or a smokestack, then there would be a real target to go after. But one of the challenges of working on food system change is that these are called non-point source emissions. They come from all over the place. There's all kinds of different interventions that are going to be required in order to reduce the total emissions into the air that the food system is contributing. But just looking quickly at a few things in agriculture, you can see there the cow is a major emitter of methane. Both ends of the cow emit methane. And within there are serious issues with the way we manage the manure, animal manure on farms. And from that manure, there are often a lot of nitrous oxide and methane emissions. And then we have emissions, particularly of N2O from soils. But interestingly, soils can be both a generator of carbon dioxide emissions and also a storer of carbon dioxide. And this speaks to one of the strategic interventions that is at least getting some attention, and that is how do we help farmers change their farming practices so that they become storers of carbon dioxide rather than emitters. We'll come back to that in a few moments. But first, just to give you a sense of how this looks across the country, these are GHG emission hotspots from a government report in 2005. And the more red the color is, the more significant hotspot it is. And again, this is looking at agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. So of course, it really reflects where agriculture happens in this country. And you can see there are some small but very intense pockets of emissions in British Columbia, particularly in the Fraser Valley near Vancouver. And then there are a lot of emissions in Alberta. That zone there where there's all those red hotspots in Alberta is called, sometimes called Livestock Alley. There's a whole lot of animal production going on in that zone. So a lot of these emissions are associated with livestock. And then there are a lot of emissions in Manitoba in the Red River Valley. Many of those are associated with crop production. It's a very intense crop production area. And then looking at Eastern Canada, look at Ontario there, especially areas west of Toronto, the Maitland Valley area, which is mostly in Huron County. It has some of the highest manure concentrations in the country, and that contributes significantly to the emissions there. But as you can see, there are emissions really all the way up through the St. Lawrence River Valley, and extensive emissions all through Quebec, and then also a little bit into New Brunswick, especially associated with potato production and also PEI, and then some in Nova Scotia as well. And then an interesting little pocket in Newfoundland where there are intense emissions. It's probably a vegetable production area there. There is agriculture in Newfoundland, in case you thought there wasn't. So if we break out agriculture's contributions then to this national inventory, again, just looking at agriculture, not the whole food system, we've seen a 10 megaton increase since 1990, or 21% increase. 70% of total national nitrous oxide emissions are associated with agriculture. So that means obviously that agriculture is the major contributor in Canada to nitrous oxide emissions. And again, this is just agriculture, not the entire food system. If we were looking at the entire food system, the number of course would be even higher. And 20% of total national methane emissions are also then coming from agriculture. And I mentioned this thing about using soil as a way to store carbon, or be what they call a carbon sink. And the federal government believes that soils, agricultural soils in Canada, are now a net carbon sink. In other words, they store more carbon than they emit. However, a lot of scientists contest this interpretation. In many ways, it's a theoretical one and doesn't necessarily play out accurately in on-the-ground testing. And my view is that it's actually an inflation of the current situation. And the problem with the federal government viewing soils as currently a net carbon sink is it makes them overly optimistic about a lot of the strategies they're employing to reduce emissions. Me and other analysts are basically saying you have to do a whole lot more advanced things than what you're doing currently if you really want to turn soils into a carbon sink. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. So what are the big drivers then of emissions in agriculture? Well, it's nitrogen fertilizer manufacturing and use is a huge one. So most farmers in Canada use synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, and this nitrogen fertilizer is made from natural gas. So the extraction and the manufacturing of fertilizer and natural gas is a significant contributor to these emissions. And then the other big one is livestock populations and livestock densities, and then the feed that we grow to nourish them. So unfortunately in Canada, we've developed a bad habit of feeding animals things for which their digestive systems are not really designed. And that means we give them a lot of things like corn and soybeans. And corn and soybeans, particularly corn, are heavy contributors to GHG emissions because of all the nitrogen fertilizer that's applied to them. So basically our problem is we've got too many animals on the landscape, and we've got too high densities of them in particular places. I mentioned some of those earlier when we were looking at those maps. Okay, so that's sort of the agricultural story, but let's look a little bit more widely at the food system contributions. And as I mentioned off the top, we don't collect very good data on all the different food system contributions, and so it's a bit harder to come up with Canadian-specific estimates that are relevant to, say, this global estimate I gave you at the beginning, that the food system globally contributes 30% of total emissions. Is Canada, you know, what part of that 30% is Canada's contribution isn't quite clear, and nor do we understand exactly how much of all Canada's emissions are associated with the food system. But here's some of the issues. If we were collecting better numbers, here's some of the things we'd want to look at. So using the categories that there's the standard categories that the government uses when they do reporting on greenhouse gas emissions, how does that relate to food system activity? So in energy, this what they call stationary energy. Well, in the food system, we have a lot of heating and cooling. In fact, you could argue that the whole food system really runs on heating and cooling. You know, the refrigerator in your house, the cooling units in the retail shop, the heating systems in the restaurants, and all the heating that food manufacturers do when they're creating some kind of a manufactured food item for you. And then, of course, they often, you know, you go into the freezer section of the retail store, and of course, all those things that you're buying frozen, they've been frozen much earlier in the process. They were frozen first in the manufacturing plant. So all these motors that do heating and cooling are a significant contributor to this category, stationary energy, and unfortunately, most of them are inefficient. In other words, a lot of the food system runs on old motors that aren't very energy efficient, so they're wasting a lot of energy, which has greenhouse gas emission implications. And there are also losses of some of the refrigerants that are used in these refrigerators, and some of the refrigerants are significant greenhouse gases. If we look at transportation, well, there's all kinds of transportation in the food system. The average food molecule in Canada is estimated to travel 4,000 kilometers. That's just the average. And it's because there's lots of transportation on the farm. And of course, how does that food get around? Well, mostly it goes around in truck, ship, rail and a little bit by air. And of course, when farmers buy these inputs, these fertilizers, for example, those are getting shipped around. That natural gas moves around in pipelines. And then all that food that we waste and throw out, somebody has to haul it away. So all this transportation is a big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see there in the notes just the extent of it. So domestically in Canada, we are estimated to move 65 billion ton kilometers. In other words, for every ton of food traveling 1 kilometer, that's known as a ton kilometer, that's the unit, and we have 65 billion of those in any particular year on average. This was from 2007. And then, of course, we're a major importer. Canada is the 6th largest food importer in the world, and we're also the 5th largest exporter. But because we import so much, 61 billion ton kilometers of food get moved into the country. Most of that comes in by ship, which is actually a good thing because ships have lower emissions per ton kilometer than do trucks. Trucks are actually the worst, and the smaller the truck gets, the worse the emissions get. So if you have somebody, moving around food in their half-ton truck, that actually per ton kilometer is the same level of emissions as an airplane. So not very good. Rail is pretty good. So we want to be moving more food around by rail and by ship than by truck and by airplane. And they have this funny category called fugitive energy. I always thought that was a funny term. And really what they're talking about here is things like the emissions that escape when they're doing oil and natural gas extraction and also from transport. And again, because nitrogen fertilizer is made from natural gas, then those emissions are happening in the food system. And of course, there's all kinds of cookers in manufacturing and at home. So it's estimated that agriculture is probably 1% of these total emissions. And of course, the food system, if we were able to add it up, would be even higher. And then the waste story. I'll come back to waste in a second, but basically there's all kinds of waste in the food system at all phases of movement from the farm to your refrigerator. And of course, there's all this residential yard waste, which is potential fertilizer, all these that leaf mulch and small pieces of branches and grass clippings and things like that. Those are all potential fertilization sources. And about 1/3 of the average city's solid waste stream is compostable material, which is huge, 1/3. And this 1/3 has higher emissions than some of the other waste does because, of course, it's a biological material. And then the last category where the food system is making significant contributions is in the industrial category. In other words, food manufacturing, input manufacturing, and equipment manufacturing. And there's lots of CO2 emitted from combustion and methane and nitrous oxide from wastewater that these produce. So as you can see, from all these different kinds of activities in the food system, there's a tremendous amount of ways in which it can contribute to emissions. Now, I mentioned the food waste story. This is perhaps the biggest indicator of a food system gone wrong, in that the estimate is that about 44% of all the plants and animals that start on a farm, all the food that comes from a farm, 44% of it never gets to your mouth, which is a shocking number. And the waste in both direct costs of food, but also then all the resources that's involved in producing that food. The estimate is $31 billion worth of food waste. Now, when you look at where the food waste is happening, it looks like you and I are the main problem, right? Oops, where did I go here? Sorry about that. That you and I are the main problem at 47%, but what that actually hides is that the way in which we behave around food waste is really triggered very much by the way in which the retail sector behaves. So the retail sector, supermarkets are designed to make you buy more food than you actually need. That's one of their fundamental design principles. So when it says that retail is only wasting 10% of the food, it's actually much higher if you consider the up and downstream effects that retail has on everybody else. So it causes us to waste more, and it also causes more waste for the farms and the food processors. So the retailer is actually the major problem in the system, even though almost half the waste actually happens in the household. So what does all this mean for the change process? Well, if you look at this chart, it looks a bit complicated, but it isn't so much really. If you look at that second column, percent food system emissions. So these are my estimates of which of the different sectors of the food system are making the biggest contributions. And part of the reason I've had to use ranges is because different reports come up with different estimates. So as you can see there, food production, farming, is about 30 to 40% of emissions. The cooling processes that I was describing earlier are 8 to 16%. Processing and packaging, 10 to 20%, transport, 10 to 20%, and consumption, the things that we do actually in the household, 20 to 30% of total emissions. But I've also tried to estimate what we could realistically save without having to do a fantastic redesign of the system. In other words, with relatively achievable strategies in the short and medium term, what kinds of savings could we generate? And you can see there that on the farm, maybe 5 to 20%. But because of these inefficient motors, if we replaced a lot of those, we could save 20 to 50% of emissions. Manufacturing efficiencies, 20 to 50%. Transport, 20 to 50%. And in the household, and if we got the retailers to do some things differently, 30 to 60% savings. So overall, that would generate, which is the fourth column, food system savings, these kinds of percentages. They look relatively modest, but when you add it all up, you're looking at something like 14 to 44% of all food system emissions could be saved with relatively modest interventions. So that means the food system is actually a potential solution. We could dramatically reduce our reliance on nitrogen fertilizer by significantly changing the way farms rotate crops and the way they manage manure. And this creates more opportunities also for storing carbon. We'd stay away from liquid biofuels. A lot of people think, well, we should be using crops to make things like ethanol. My view is that's a bad strategy. And we'd have to dramatically reduce animal populations, particularly the large animals, the cattle, that are metabolically inefficient. In other words, they require a lot of feed and they don't convert it that well into things that we can eat. And reductions and changes in the type of animal feed would also be significant. And we want to expand ecological horticultural production. In other words, production that's designed to take account of ecological realities, using short supply chains and innovative greenhouse designs, and use trucks as little as possible, and have revised grading standards for those fruits and vegetables so that we don't waste that much of it. And my last thought on this is, what can we do as eaters? Obviously, when we go into a supermarket, we're making decisions about what kind of a food system we want. In a way, every dollar you spend in a store is a vote for the kind of food system you want. So if we want to be eaters that were really concerned about reducing GHG emissions, this is what we do. We'd eat primarily an ecologically produced plant-based diet, and we'd probably be eating less because, as I say, the retailers encourage us to eat more. It would be minimally processed food, and most of it would be sourced within a few hundred kilometers and hopefully distributed as much by rail as possible. And if by truck, then at least some kind of an innovative approach and with minimal packaging. And the imports would come in primarily by ship and rail so that we minimize truck traffic. And we'd be in an urban area, at least, we'd walk more. We'd have smaller shopping trips more frequently to hopefully more local shops. And we'd do things like drying and canning in the off season. And we'd stay away from aluminum cans because they're huge energy takes. And all this, of course, means changes in taste, because if we're not going to be importing a lot of fruits and vegetables in the winter from other places because we're doing other things domestically, then it obviously shapes the way we choose to eat. So that's the kind of stuff that we can do as eaters to support some of these broader changes I'm talking about. And there's some of the sources if you want to follow up on some of those. So hope you found that useful and look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Rod. We actually had a question come in already, so let's see if you're familiar with it. There has been a recent study that says feeding certain types of seaweed to cattle can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 95%. Are you aware of that study?
Sorry, could you repeat that one?
It's a study that says feeding a certain type of seaweed to cattle can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 95%. So you're familiar with it?
Yeah, there's a number of studies that suggest that if we change what they call the feed additives, we can reduce emissions. And certainly that can be a contributing factor. But really, as I mentioned, the fundamental problem is not the additives we provide to animals. It's the number of animals that are on the landscape and the basic feed we're giving them, like the corn and the soybeans.
Okay, because I think part of the question too was, given that seaweed would have to be shipped very far, would the shipping outweigh the benefits of the greenhouse gas emissions?
Would depend on how it was shipped. If we were shipping seaweed by boat from, say, somewhere more tropical, that would have lower emissions than if we were bringing it in by truck.
Okay. So unfortunately, the answer is it really depends.
Right.
All right. So the next question that I was going to ask was related to your expertise. Do you see policy or individual actions playing a bigger role in greenhouse gas emissions within the agricultural sector?
Well, they're both important. The problem, what happens I think for most people, either in their own shopping habits or if they're working, say, for a non-governmental organization that's working on climate change, is that you always end up running into the policy system, because the policy system really sets the rules by which the food system operates. So even if you're working on a community project that's designed to help a community reduce its emissions, at some point in doing that work, you're going to run into the policy system. And if you don't know how to try and influence it and figure out how to get it to change some of those rules to create disincentives for emissions, then you're ultimately not going to be that successful. So they're both really critical, but you have to sort of approach them in a coordinated fashion so that they're not competing with each other.
Okay. And this is the point where we will be opening up the Q&A period. So if anyone on the chat has anything they'd like to ask Rod, now is the time to get your questions in. I did have one question. You mentioned CO2 equivalent in one slide. Is that the same thing as global warming potential?
No, that's a different measurement. And so this is also one of the challenges around figuring out what the role is of these different sectors, is that different studies will use different measures of impact. So the global warming potential one is more, it's a different kind of aggregate measure like CO2 equivalent, but it's based on different mathematics.
Okay. Oh, we have a question. This one's from Cheryl. She asks if you see a way to bring down the price of local food, so within that 100 kilometers, to compete with the imports from large supermarkets.
That's a huge issue because, of course, what happens with a lot of the imported food is that they're able to do it with higher volumes, which then reduces their per unit costs, which then, of course, makes it cheaper in the supermarket. So in Canada, because we have we have a lower population, obviously, than say the United States, which is our biggest food trading partner, then we don't produce as much per unit, and that, of course, tends to increase our costs. Having said that, again, because we have so many inefficiencies in the way our systems work, if we deal with those efficiencies, then we create the possibility of keeping our prices at the same level as imports. So, for example, I work with a chef here at York University who's very innovative around how do you basically have a very healthy, sustainable menu at your restaurant and keep it at the same price as all the other restaurants. And a big part of her strategy is managing her food inventory and minimizing the amount of food waste. So she's finding that if she does those things, then she can keep everything affordable. So that's just an example, I think, of what can happen if we're really creative about the way we reorganize our food supply chains, including making them more local.
Okay. So we have a lot of questions coming in right now. Going back a bit, Julie asked if there's some alternative ways to use bio or food waste, or for example, methane as well.
There is, but I think it's quite different from the way in which it tends to get discussed. So one of the dilemmas that happens with the traditional approaches to food waste is if you turn that food waste into, say, a biogas, or even if you're often donating it, obviously we want to donate food that's still good to people in need. But if you set up your systems so that you're creating a demand for wasted food. In other words, you create demand for biogas by needing this food waste to feed your biodigesters. When you do that, you actually can ultimately sabotage efforts to reduce food waste, because reducing is always the first step in the process. We only want to reuse and recycle later in the process of managing waste. The first thing is always, what can we do to reduce waste in the first place? But if you have these buyers who want to buy your food waste because they're dependent on it for things like methane production, then you can actually drive food waste up. And unfortunately, this happened in Ontario with recycling. I was involved in some of the discussions way back in the 1980s when curbside recycling programs were happening in Ontario. And basically the government at the time admitted that they were setting up a system that would generate more waste so we could recycle it. And that's crazy in terms of environmental strategy and environmental policy. And we for sure want to stay away from that approach with trying to minimize food waste. So yes, there are certain things that we know humans can't eat. About a third of the food waste stream is stuff that we can't eat. So we want to do something useful with that. And if we can isolate things like methane production to those waste streams of things that we can't consume, then that's a good use of that material. But the problem right now is that there's all kinds of stuff that we could use in different ways, and it's all getting funneled into biogas digesters because they have such an appetite for it.
Okay. Let's move on to the next one. There was a question saying, if corn is a heavy producer of greenhouse gas emissions, would it be better if that corn was swapped out for pasture-fed beef as opposed to?
It would be. Yes, very much so. So really what we want to be doing is feeding animals things that humans don't eat as much as possible. And of course, we're not particularly good digesters of grass. I've tried, and it doesn't go down very well. So if we give the grass to the animals who have 4 stomachs, the cattle, the sheep, they have lots of stomachs. Their digestive systems are designed for grass. So if we can feed them as much as possible grass, then it takes a lot of the pressure off farmers to produce what's really often low quality corn and very low priced corn for the animal feed market. And then we can use that land for other kinds of things that are things humans can eat.
Okay. We have another question that's asking about bilateral agreements like the Paris Accord versus local, so state or provincial regulations. Is one better than the other in your opinion, or more impactful?
Well, I think this is quite a challenging question in the sense that Canada has a funny history with a lot of these international accords, not just around climate change. We have this unfortunate habit, especially related to food issues, of being, say, a star in the negotiations for a new kind of international accord. So we look really good, we sign on to the agreement, and then we come home and do nothing. So the international accord, in theory, that we've participated in sets the stage for us to do something really significant. But then we don't back it up with the right kinds of programs and policy changes at a domestic level to really bring those international commitments to fruition. So it's really got to be both at the same time. And of course, because governments are only able to do certain kinds of things well, they need collaborators, they need community partners, they need organizations on the ground that can do all kinds of interesting things. So governments have to get better at creating what are called these multi-stakeholder processes that engage with different kinds of actors who have the skills and the capacity to pull a lot of this stuff together. And unfortunately, their ability to do that is often a bit compromised as well. So unfortunately, then we end up with a situation where often the community actors and the businesses are doing things on their own, not necessarily connected to what government is doing and not necessarily leading us towards our commitments that we've signed internationally. So again, we got to get all this stuff joined up. It's called a joined up policy approach. And the more we do that, then the more effective we can be.
Okay. We also had a question from Mark. He was referring to one of your earlier slides about reducing cattle farming. And he's curious that if we reduce the number of cattle operations, but don't manage to decrease demand for cattle, that there will be a lot of importing happening. Is that an alternative? Does that help us with our greenhouse gas emissions?
You mean if we're importing cattle products instead of doing it domestically?
Yes.
Again, it depends on how the products come into the country. That's one dimension of the issue. So unfortunately, we are actually big importers of cattle products, which seems kind of funny given that we're also big exporters, but we do a lot of that in Canada. We import and export the same stuff, which is totally inefficient and contributes, of course, to a lot of these greenhouse gas emissions. And unfortunately, with cattle, most of our imports come from the United States, and the bulk of them come in by truck. So if we're importing by truck, we're not necessarily making any savings. If they were coming in by, for example, refrigerated rail, then that might be a way to make savings on the transportation side. But ultimately, the big issue is the raising of cattle themselves. If we raise cattle on grass, as one of the previous questions suggested, if we raise cattle on grass, and we minimize the transport, and we use the whole animal, because unfortunately right now a lot of farmers have trouble selling their animals because only certain cuts of meat are favored by certain buyers. And so you get all this food waste associated with cattle production that doesn't necessarily have to be there if we had a more diverse approach to eating whatever meat we choose to eat. So if we could solve some of those problems, then we can dramatically reduce emissions from the cattle sector domestically, and so wouldn't need to rely on an import strategy to achieve some reductions.
Right. So essentially, properly, we're still going to have issues overall. It's a global issue.
Sorry, could you say that again? You just broke up there a little bit.
Sorry. Essentially, even if we just choose to import our cattle and it's raised in a way that produces greenhouse gas emissions, since it's a global issue, we'll still have the same consequences.
Exactly. We might not be having the emissions here, but we're contributing to the emissions somewhere else.
Sure. Okay, so moving on, since lots of questions coming in. We have a question about the book Drawdown, which says pasture cropping in Australia is said to increase agricultural output and reduce reliance on fertilizers and pesticides. Are you familiar with that book?
Not with that book, no, but I've heard the argument before.
Can that system work in Canada, or is it specific to Australia?
Well, I don't know the details of that particular system, but of course, there are certain parallels between certain regions of Australia and, say, the Canadian prairies. I mean, the Canadian prairies are really a desert, which of course is why you regularly hear these reports of drought coming out of the prairies. So there are certain areas of Australia, especially not the super dry areas, sort of more in the sort of the Middle East and the southern part of Australia that probably have conditions that are relatively similar to our prairies. Once you get obviously into the desert in Australia, where there is a significant amount of cattle production, it's a different kind of dynamic. But I suspect there would be, in terms of the technique, there would be direct parallels for certain parts of Australia. But also what often happens with these kinds of ecological approaches is you take the principles that work somewhere else and you just adapt them to your local ecology. So, and that's really what's been happening with pasture management all over the world. There are many innovative approaches to pasture management which significantly increase productivity at very low environmental expenditure. And a lot of different theorists have come up with different strategies. There's the holistic resource management, Alan Savory, who grew up in southern Africa. There's the French system of voisin grazing. A lot of these are based on similar kinds of principles and then just adapted to the local conditions.
Okay, so it sounds like it could potentially work. I know from some of our past partnerships and Envirothon that there's a lot of work going into like no-till cropping and water management to reduce impact.
Yeah, no-till is, if I could just add a little bit on no-till. No-till is, again, a tricky one because the dominant approaches to no-till in Canada, in my view, are part of the problem. And the reason is because they're still very dependent typically on nitrogen fertilizer, and they often increase the farmer's reliance on herbicides and fungicides. And the kind of carbon that gets stored in a lot of no-till systems, that again, the dominant approaches, a lot of the carbon that gets stored isn't very stable. And when I was raising this issue about the debates around whether Canadian agricultural soils are storing our net carbon sinks, it's actually related to this no-till question. Having said that, there is a way to do no-till that is super ecological and addresses all those things. So again, it's one of those ones where it depends on what kind of no-till you're doing, whether you can actually have the beneficial impact you think.
Okay. We've also had a couple questions about how food packaging plays into greenhouse gas emissions. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, definitely it's a factor. It's a factor both directly and indirectly. So it's a direct factor, obviously, in the manufacturing of the packaging material, and of course the movement of packaging materials. So I mean, packaging materials move all around the country even before they get around some food. So the manufacturing is a factor, and the distribution, but then also the sophistication of the packaging strategy has a big impact on issues like food waste. So there are two big dimensions to that. One is that a lot of food is actually overpackaged. And so the overpackaging contributes to unnecessary weight, which has to get moved, which again emits more energy. And it also means that if you got more packaging than you need, then it often then means that you're not getting as much food into the truck or the boat or whatever it is because you've got all this excess packaging on it, which then reduces your per unit volume. And so then you have to use more shipping or more trucking in order to get the same amount of food to a particular place. Whereas if you had a more innovative packaging strategy that was much more efficient and wasn't so so much a result of food safety paranoia. So a lot of the food companies in this country are absolutely terrified of a food safety scare. And of course, food safety is a serious issue. But they get a little bit overly paranoid, and so then they overly package things. But there are a lot of folks now who are really looking at innovative packing designs, and a lot of companies, by just changing their packaging strategy, have found that they can reduce their transport emissions by 10, 15, 20% because they get more food in the truck.
Okay, so you make it like an economic issue.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've also had a question. Does organic farming have a greater impact, so lower greenhouse gas emissions, compared to traditional approaches or like the modern approaches we're using now?
Absolutely. Organic farming is definitely part of the solution. I've done some work with some colleagues, and our estimate is that organic farming can generate reductions in GHGs in the order of 30 to 60%, depending on the system and what particular kind of farming is being done. You know, obviously, it's not the same for, say, fruits and vegetables as it might be for dairy. So, but you can get tremendous savings, and these savings have been confirmed in studies from all over the globe. So when I raised in my slides this notion of eating ecologically, the easiest way to do that in Canada right now is to buy organic food. And because it is organic, that means that all up and down the supply chain, there will be savings in GHGs.
Okay, and does that have anything to do with the produce itself being non-GMO? That was another question. Or is it the practices that you're using in organic farming?
It's a combination of things. So one of the first big ways in which organic farmers save emissions is they don't use synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. You're not allowed to use synthetic nitrogen fertilizer according to organic farming standards. So that means you have to use different kinds of biological sources. And to do that, it usually means that you're paying much more attention to your composting practices, which then means hopefully you're reducing emissions. But it also means you've got a more complex crop rotation. So you're managing your crops in a different way. You're keeping your soil covered for longer periods of the year, which again reduces emissions. And you're also using a lot of leguminous plants, nitrogen fixing plants, as part of your rotation because they're a key part of your fertilizer strategy. So when you do all those things, you're not only protecting the soil, but then you're also a greater storer of carbon. So you emit less and you store more. So for all those reasons, yes, organic farmers are making a significant contribution.
Moving on, the next question we had relates to shipping. You've talked a bit about how trucking is a very inefficient method, and sometimes shipping by sea has lower greenhouse gas emissions. But does shipping by sea have issues with sulfur emissions? Yeah,
so there are many issues with shipping that aren't necessarily connected to the GHG story. There's all kinds of pollution, obviously, from ships. So whether it's sulfur emissions or leaking gas tanks, exhaust, combustion emissions, stuff people throw overboard or fall off the boat. Obviously, where does all this plastic come from? Well, at least some of it has to be coming from the ships. So there's all kinds of problems with shipping, and for sure, in general, we need to seriously reduce the amount of food that we're moving around the globe. The more we can do that, better, I think. But again, if we're trying to choose between different modes of transport, then shipping is one of the better ones, again, on a ton-kilometer basis, because the amount of food you can move in a boat is so significant, and the amount of fuel you expend to do that is way lower than, say, a small truck or an airplane.
Okay. And the impacts of looking at sulfur emissions, we're talking about acidification, I assume.
Yeah, acidification is one of the things. The problem with a lot of boats is that they use what's called bunker oil or bunker fuel, and it has a high sulfur content. And so what's happening in many jurisdictions now is that they're requiring the shipping companies to retrofit their shipping motors so that they can use a low sulfur fuel. So some jurisdictions, Canada has done a little bit of that, but other jurisdictions have been more serious about forcing their boats to do this. Now, unfortunately, a lot of boats are not registered where they work, and so the rules don't necessarily apply to them. I don't know if you've ever noticed that many ships around the world are registered out of Liberia in West Africa. And unfortunately, the rules in Liberia are not as stringent as they are in some other parts of the world. And so that's obviously why a lot of boats are registered there.
I have heard of that. Okay, so shipping has its concerns, but they are probably a little distant from greenhouse gas compared to other types. Next question. Since we're talking about cattle consumption and the fact that eating meat has a big impact, would something like consuming fish be a better alternative, or does it still have significant greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, unfortunately, yes, going vegetarian is a good thing in terms of reducing emissions. Not that everyone has to go vegetarian, but the more we reduce our animal product consumption, generally the more we'll contribute to the planet. Again, the reason is because it will result in fewer animals on the landscape. So one of the reasons we have so many animals on the landscape is because so many people are eating a lot of meat. And unfortunately, and this comes from a lot of the nutritionists, most people in Canada, most people are in the industrial world are over-consuming animal product for optimal health. So there's a health imperative to reduce our animal product consumption, and there's also an ecological one, and somewhat related to greenhouse gas emissions and other pollution factors. So some people have done studies. For example, they said, well, if everybody who is a meat eater decided to go vegetarian one day a week, that would actually maybe save as many emissions as localizing the food system, because emissions associated with animals are so much higher than emissions associated with transport. So yes, reducing meat consumption is a critical part of this. Again, not everyone has to go vegetarian, but if we were all eating less animal product, that would be a good thing.
So essentially, like a hierarchy of cattle being one of the biggest contributors in terms of meat consumption. Would fish be in the middle or low, or is that hard to measure?
Right. So yes, thank you. Back to the fish story. So the bigger issue with fish now is that of course we've emptied the oceans, or many oceans, and we have a serious ecological crisis associated with overfishing. So if we were to tell everybody to eat less meat and eat more fish, the problem is we'd end up with even more overfishing, or we'd end up with more fish farming. Now, the problem with fish farming, the way we mostly do it, is that it actually echoes a lot of the problems with animal farming. So we'd basically be, trading off equivalencies here. If we said, eat less beef, but eat that fish farm salmon, we'd probably be talking about relatively equivalent emissions processes. There are ecological approaches to fish farming, but they're still in a minority. And about half the fish that is produced in the world right now is coming from fish farming, so it's huge.
Yeah, especially when you do something like salmon, right? You're farming a fish that has such high dietary requirements as opposed to farming something like sardines that don't.
Right.
Okay, we only have a couple more questions. We'll see which ones we can get through in the next 5-ish minutes. We were talking about vegetarian diets, which leads really well into the next question. Someone was wondering, how fast is it anticipated we would notice greenhouse gas decreases if a large number of people went vegetarian at once?
Yeah, it would, the emissions, the problem, I suppose, of the food system now is that it's so complex that when you get a change in demand, how quickly does it go back through the system to the farm? And sometimes it takes several years, but sometimes it can be relatively rapid. But for sure, we want changes, but we don't want them to be too dramatic, because it takes all these other processes in the food system a little bit of time to equilibrate to the new realities. Unfortunately, we have this phenomena in farming called the boom or bust cycle, where one year, everything's going fantastically and you're making a fantastic amount of money, and the year after, everything collapses and you've got serious cash flow problems. So we don't want to do things that can accentuate that boom and bust cycle. So that requires planning and coordination. And unfortunately, we don't have too much of that in the food system right now, but we need a lot more of it.
I guess given how long certain crops, they can't be expected to be so nimble to respond to a change within a few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, for example, if you're doing tree fruits, and trees take a while to grow, then if there's a sudden dramatic increase in demand for apples or grapes or peaches, or a sudden decline, you're not going to be able to adjust to that very quickly, because it takes 3, 4, or 5 years for these trees to establish. There are other sectors which are really based entirely on annual crops, and then you've got more annual flexibility. But because of the distortions in the food system, a lot of the price signals are all messed up in the food system. So farmers don't necessarily get the right price signals. So that's part of the reason why, if there's a big change somewhere, it doesn't necessarily translate immediately into a change on the ground.
Okay. Now, kind of backtracking a bit, we did have a question about alternatives to nitrogen, and I feel like we touched on that in the organic farming comment. So what are those alternatives, say, to synthetic nitrogen?
Right. So a big one, of course, is manure. If you do have animals on your farm, hopefully at a lower stocking level than you would in a conventional farm. That's what happens with most organic farmers. They actually deliberately reduce the number of animals they have on their operation. But if you manage that manure well, then the manure becomes part of your replacement strategy for eliminating nitrogen fertilizer. Another one is, as I mentioned, these nitrogen-fixing crops, these leguminous plants, and you work them into the rotation, the clovers, the alfalfas, those kinds of plants. You work them into the rotation so that they contribute nitrogen to the following crop. And there's also a strategy called green manuring, which sounds like a funny name, but basically it's a strategy where you deliberately grow a crop as a fertilizer and you plow it under the soil, or you till it into the soil when it's still quite green and has a high nitrogen percentage, so that it can serve that function, but you deliberately work that into your rotational strategy. So those are some of the main strategies that organic farmers use.
Okay, and I have one more question just to wrap it up, and I'm going to bring this back to the cattle questions that Mark was bringing up earlier, just to kind of round this out. Mark was asking, given that we need to reduce our cattle demand, but if demand remains high, how do we balance that? Is it a policy issue or is it a societal movement?
I'd say it's both, but one of the problems from a governmental perspective is we have this idea in most Western countries, and here I'm paraphrasing former Prime Minister Trudeau Sr. He said years ago, there is no role for the state in the bedrooms of the nation. But if you paraphrase that and say there is no role for the state in the kitchens of the nation, that actually reflects the way most policymakers think about this issue of encouraging different kinds of consumption. So even though we've got enormous health problems associated with our diets, governments are extremely reluctant to intervene in the demand for food. They do all kinds of stuff to manage supply. They won't really do much at all to manage demand, and that is a huge error. In World War II, that was really the last time in Canada we had a serious approach to managing food demand, because otherwise we would have ended up with enormous shortages. So in a certain way, we've got to take the lessons, obviously update them, entirely different circumstances now. We got to take the lessons from World War II on how to manage demand and reapply them in Canada to things like encouraging people to eat a low GHG emission diet.
Okay, well, I think we're going to wrap it there. There might have been a couple questions that I missed. I'll go back through and I'll direct people to some resources to help answer those. But I did want to say thank you so much for everyone for joining us, and thank you especially, Rod, for sharing your expertise and talking for an hour straight.
My pleasure.
Okay, thanks so much, everyone. If you have any questions or comments about the webinar, you can reach me at ahands@forestontario.ca. Have a good afternoon.